You're listening to the Perth Property Show, Australia's only weekly property podcast by West Australian experts for West Australian listeners. Catch your latest episode every Monday at 7 a.m.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Perth Property Show. My name's Trent, your host as always, and today we celebrate 300 weeks in a row of the Perth Property Show. It was December 2018 when Brendan Ptolemy and myself recorded the first ever episode, and the episode was essentially titled Green Shoots, Where's the Perth Market Going? December 2018. Today we sit at the end of August in 2024 after what has been a crazy ride of 300 weeks, nearly 6 years in this market. We've seen COVID, we've seen building grants, we've seen oversupply turn into undersupply, prices rise over 50%, and in some suburbs prices double in that time frame. Rents rise nearly 90% in that time as well. And to have a conversation about that story, where things are sitting in a micro Perth space, in a more macro Australian space, the man I want to talk to is Col Dutton, GM of Stockland in WA and the National President of UDIA. Thank you for coming in, mate.
Thanks, Trent. Appreciate the invite.
It's been a couple of years since you were in first. It's crazy how fast time flies. Last time we were talking, we were still coming out of COVID. We were in a strong market, but certainly not a market that's been as strong as the last 12 months, especially in the land space. We've seen some really big price increases. We've seen people flock back to that house and land space, but that is as a response to that first moving market, which was the established space. Jesus, prices have risen both in a sales and rental price spot, haven't they?
Yeah, definitely. The land market started to see it about May, June last year, and I think the established market, just as you obviously talk about in regard to becoming so tight in both a rental and a sales space, it kept tightening, and I think customers decided to look to alternate, and obviously a new build is where they've turned to in the last 12 months.
Isn't it interesting, the dynamic there? Because obviously there was this huge vacuuming of clients from the future into 2020 with the building grants in June 2020. And that obviously extended through into 2021, and it took 2 to 3 years for most people's houses to get built. Some still, you could believe, not built yet, not finished. We see it on the Facebook groups, and I feel sorry, very sorry for those people stuck in that space. Hundreds of building companies have gone broke in that time. And so what happened was most people who hadn't gone into that building boost house and land space stayed in the safe established market, I guess you could say, right? And they were still seeing value. We had a lot of East Coast investors pumping through Gosnells, Rockingham, Mandurah, Banksia Grove. The city of Armidale then saw in the last 2 years upwards of 70% growth, which is crazy to believe. We're now looking at established 3x1s, 4x1s selling for $600,000 in Armidale. You'd never think it. But that is obviously starting to filter into people 50th in line for that property in Armidale they probably never thought they'd be lining up for. It's turning to their partner and going, maybe we should have a look at that land estate down the road in Champion Lakes or in Piara Waters. Maybe builders aren't as busy as they used to be, and maybe we can have a look at those trade rates that we never thought we'd be looking at these prices. But when you compare it to a 50-year-old house down the road, it's starting to stack up.
Definitely. Going back quickly, the contracts are still being worked through by a number of builders, as we see, as you said, on the Facebook groups and everything else. But back then, I think that the boost that came in sucked up a lot of land supply. There was ample land supply at that time after 5 6 years of pretty depressed activity, whereas particularly in the last few months, land is controlling the amount of builds that can take place.
Explain that to us in a bit more detail.
The builders don't have a certain book. The older contracts are still being worked through, particularly by some of the smaller builders that we hear about. But certainly in regard to a customer getting a block of land, it's at least 6 months before the builder can get to the block of land at the moment. The average would be, I'd say, 6 to 9 months in regard to getting a builder onto a block of land because of the land market, if you like. The capacity is full at the moment.
So that's tempering the build pipeline, whereas
Yes.
before it was nearly open slather. If you wanted to build, pick your block and go for it. And so the building companies ratcheting up 10 times their capacity, taking what they can, even if they can't actually stomach it. Now what you're saying is, hey, look, they're probably actually being tempered now. They might have a capacity for 100 homes a year. They only have access to 70 blocks of land.
Yeah, it's a healthier market. It's a more legible market. It is constrained in regard to choice of land in a timely fashion, but it's actually tempering the amount of starts that can take place. And I think it's a healthier than when you're grabbing, 3 or 4 years ago, through the COVID stimulus, grabbing whatever you wanted. It's a more balanced market, and I think you'll see the costs for builders temper as well, because they'll have to give certainty to the customer who won't get on their land to 6, 9 months, 12 months possibly. They'll want certainty in regard to their build price. So I think you'll see the builders responding to that with guarantees on build price. So that's a good market.
And we heard that from Jay Walter a couple of weeks ago, talking to the fact that build prices are starting to normalise. They're certainly not going to go back down to the prices pre-COVID, but there's more confidence about if we quote you 400 today, we can probably hold you 400 in a few months' time, because trade rates are normalising. And I'm connecting the dots here. The reason for why they're normalising is because their workflow is being normalised, is being tempered by the bandwidth of where you can build. Have you ever been in a situation historically where the throughput of land is controlling the bandwidth there? It's the tunnel on the freeway?
It has in the past, particularly back in WA in 13, 14. I think the added dimension at the moment is the customer can't get into new apartments, can't get into new medium density at the moment. So the greenfield house and land is really holding up its end to actually provide a supply.
There's no alternative is what you're saying.
No, and you've got the tight established market, as you talk about, tight and rental market. So people are having to make a decision. The only new decision they can make, the main new decision they can make is through the house and land product.
And logically, what's happening in that space, a free market where there is limited supply, and we can talk about why that's limited, certainly not our choice as developers, and constant demand, and demand being funneled towards this space, as you said, whereas before it would be spread out amongst different products, prices are starting to go up. So not only has the house building price gone up over the last 5 years, but since that glut of land has been soaked up, and now we're in the space of 10 buyers for every 7 pieces of land maybe, there's certainly price rises occurring. Now, one example I'm seeing, a year ago, I sold an infill land development in Canning Vale at $1,050 a square metre. There hadn't been a lot of data at that point to prove it, but we got it sold over a few months. And at the same time, Piara Waters was selling for maybe $900, $950, which makes sense. It's a slightly less amenable product than Canning Vale, that area. Now we're hearing that land in Piara Waters selling for $1,300 a square metre. In Henleybrook, companies like Land Group, like Mirvac, were selling land for $750 a square metre at best a year and a bit ago. We're now seeing prices at $1,000 a square metre in these spaces, and I'm sure you can give us some more examples too. There's certainly been an increase in price, in some cases $100,000 to get the same block of land over the last 12 months.
Yeah, Stockland operates in all the major corridors, but the example you gave in Canning Vale, basically a lot of the land within the existing suburb and the inner suburbs is really accelerated as well. So it's a lack of supply across the board. And I suppose the likes of the UDIA and ourselves in regard to approaching government, supply is the number one issue. How do we get more product to market more quickly? And I think that's the key issue that we have to address, not only here in WA, but it's also happening in most of the other states as well. Why does it take so long to get communities to market?
Well, let's put your UDIA national president hat on for a moment and talk nationally if we can. When you have these round tables with the equivalents of your Kerrys and Safiotis around the country, what's the explanation? Is it always the same themes? Is it the same agencies, water and power, that are getting in the way? Is it red tape? Is it culture? What's happening across the country?
From what I've seen, I've been national president for the last year, the consistent theme is the front-end approvals, which is at the state level, the coordination of infrastructure, which again is at the state level, whether it be water, the likes of Western Power, and then environmental approvals. So you get to see the consistent themes across the different states. Victoria's fairly soft at the moment, but they've still got the same issues. The state government there is looking at how they get out of some of their debt. One of their levers is putting more charges on land or invest in land or invest in property.
Which just ends up with the end user.
Yeah, exactly right. But the front-end approval and providing more supply, putting aside the commerciality of the ability to get a built form out of the ground, which is difficult after the increase in costs and everything else, but it's consistent across every state that it takes so long to get a planning approval to bring communities or bring projects to market. There's a whole lot of lack of coordination on infrastructure in regard to funding across every state. And environmental approvals, and a lot of the approvals that are both, environmental approvals are both at the state and the federal level through the EPBC. So it's how do we cut through the red tape at the front end is the number one key industry challenge, and it will continue unless we do something quite severe in regard to making it more efficient.
Isn't it interesting how at the federal level we hear a real impetus, I think a genuine attempt, or at least a genuine interest to want to fix this problem at a federal level. We want to build this many homes, we want to increase supply by this much. But ironically, that doesn't seem to be filtering down. I think I see it at a strategic level in WA at least. There is an intent as well. I think Minister Kerry is trying to do what he can. I think Minister Saffioti in her space is trying to do what she can, whether I agree with everything that she's doing or not doing in that space itself. But as you said, it isn't connecting through to at an officer level or a cultural level from a strategic point to an implementation side of things. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, 100%. And WA's a really good example. WA, from my perspective, strategically and politically, are really on the front foot in regard to wanting to solve the housing crisis, particularly introducing legislation. They're setting up structure, the housing supply unit in the Treasurer's area. They've got a real intent to solve this.
Their heads aren't in the sand.
Yep, that's right. They get it. They know. And it's both cost of living and housing is two top issues federally and locally.
But it's a political issue now as well. I mean, when was the last time cost of living was a political issue?
Yeah, and I suppose the issue, and like all good intent and strategic intent, it's the execution. So a lot of the interactions we have as an industry across the board, there's not always a collaborative approach where people are prepared to be pragmatic and look across their department to get a more holistic outcome to actually help create supply. It's how do we change the culture to make that happen? To me, it's a real issue within our industry and our interactions with government bodies. How do we allow them to identify that they're part of the solution and part of creating a solution?
And I've mentioned it this way before, and I don't mean to be alarmist by saying this word, but I feel like we need a wartime culture. I feel like everyone needs to get on board where the number one priority here is not ticking KPIs, is not meeting budgets or making sure that I'm not going to get in trouble with this. The number one priority should be, is this policy or is this decision assisting with housing supply or is it not? And that should be the priority.
Yeah.
And most other things should be secondary to that.
Yeah, to me it's leadership. And you don't have to go back to war. You can go back to COVID, where McGowan sent letters to the local authorities, tell them to get on with it, get on with approvals, get on with
Stop faffing
opening up
around.
supply.
Yeah.
I think we're in that very same spot right now, both locally and in parts nationally. We've had examples where, in regard to request for information, it's just a bucket of 120 pages asking us for more information that's not collated properly. It's just a whole lot of asks from a whole lot of different departments and officers just throwing whatever they can at a large approval, rather than, hey, what are the top three issues here? How do we navigate through these? What is reasonable and relevant? What is pragmatic in regard to getting this project out of the ground?
Yeah.
That is the bridge we have to get across.
Well, just from a practical point of view, when you think about a subdivision approval and whether you're a 2-lot subdivider or a 500-lot subdivider like Stockland, you get the same Form 1A approval when you lodge a subdivision application. I've had people tell me that just 20 years ago, their applications might have 3 or 4 conditions for approval. Do this, do this, do this, make sure there's water, make sure there's power, make sure the land has been cleared, and you can have your approval. And now we see documents that sit there with 5, 6, 7, 8 pages of just condition after condition after condition, advice. And most of it means cost, but a lot of it means time. And when you've gone and done all that work, it's then more and more time proving that those conditions have actually been done to get clearances. One of the issues that we see practically on the ground, especially in the land development space, and we will talk to the build form space shortly, is you see a lot of land developers who want to get their products off the ground, the civil contractor's ready to go. They'll go and develop a whole new estate without having actually gotten any response back from Western Power in that whole time. They put an application in with Western Power to say, hey, we'd like to get approval for powering these lots and put a transformer over here next to the park, for example. And in the time that Western Power got back to them, they'd already done the whole subdivision. And they're sitting there looking to get a clearance when they haven't even had an approval yet. It's mental to think that you can go and build an estate and some fella can't just pick up an application on his desk at Western Power and assess whether that done by private electrical engineers fits code. Then you start thinking, well, what are the practical ways we can fix that?
Yeah, and there was initiatives, and I think the UDIA actually got involved in the infrastructure committee. It took fortnightly meetings with the Premier to get a coordinated approach to that. It has landed, particularly in the greenfield. There's still problems there. But certainly looking at the way they did things, whether it be by private certifying or changing their process, it always was going to have to happen. You can't keep doing what you're doing and expect a better result. So that was a good example where the industry got involved and helped influence it. And to that, Western Power, to their credit, acknowledged it and started the change.
It's still a problem though, Col. We're seeing this at both a small scale infill level and a medium scale land development space too, where even at strategic in our projects, we're finished before Western Power's even given us a quote. Yeah. Which is phenomenal.
Yeah. And I suppose that's being aware of it, acknowledging we got an issue, committing to a solution and staying live on it is really, whether it be Western Power or others. And a lot of that was operational issues. To me, there's a real need to have a more strategic approach to the rollout of all the key infrastructure that's in line with the expectations of the planning in regard to the different corridors particularly, but also within the infilled areas as well.
Well, we talk about that rolling out of planning. We can talk to Water Corporation, for example. Henley Brook, a suburb that Rita Saffioti sponsored the subdivision of essentially on a policy side a few years ago. Sitting there now with what will be close to 1,000 lots by the end of the year, still hasn't had its sewer connected to the wastewater treatment plant a suburb away. And we have to think, well, where was the coordination with that? We look to the next fringe of land development in East Wanneroo, where is probably the next frontier, we can call it. What's holding that up? Well, a lot of it has to do with when are we going to get infrastructure in there so that these lots we could create tomorrow actually have somewhere to connect sewer and power to. This is what's holding it up in a practical level, isn't it?
Yeah, and the state government and Rita and John Kerry particularly, but also Reece Whitby, to their credit, and the Water Minister, we had a round table a couple of months ago with key developers, the industry bodies and the Director Generals from the various departments were involved, and they acknowledged that we can do better, and that's been left with the Housing Supply Unit. So the intention is good. The execution, as I said before, is where the challenge is. And there's a lot of responsibility being put on the Housing Supply Unit. I haven't seen a similar body be created in any other state. So I think at the front end, the government's onto it. I think, again, it comes down to the characters and the people involved, and bringing it to life is where the challenge is. So
this Housing Supply Unit, and we know it was obviously spoken of and introduced as a concept a few months ago. What's it doing at the moment? Do we think it's probably too early days to put a scorecard there?
Well, it's probably the end of last year that it was formed. I think it needs to show its own KPIs in regard to what it's trying to achieve, show, I suppose, how the different departments acknowledge it. It is in Treasury, so getting a coordinated approach, if it's infrastructure coordination, making sure it's got a real spotlight on what's required where. East Wanneroo, North Ellenbrook, East Kwinana, they're areas that round table that we had identified, and they're coming back with a plan. So I suppose the proof will be what pops out. But the industry is definitely, we're keen, Stockland's keen, the industry's keen to help pull it together and help execute it.
And empower it, right? It can't be a toothless tiger. It needs to be a unit that the head of these agencies, the officers in these agencies, actually respect and work with.
Exactly. And I think being in Treasury gives it that respect. Money, and the same for federal government, influence in regard to housing supply through the federal government is mainly through money. Incentivising states to do the right thing, incentivising states in regard to infrastructure provision. It's important that it sits with ability to go to the Economic Review Committee or whatever it is in each state and actually put their hand up and show the need for this top three issue in Australia.
That's right. We can extend that to incentivising local governments, right? Brad Pettit, who's the leader of the Greens in WA, we don't agree on everything, but I think he's a pragmatic man who is trying to help in a lot of spaces in the housing side. One of his ideas is, hey, state governments should be incentivising local governments with grants or with the withholding of grants for properly and proactively updating their local planning schemes so that we're not just zoning for today, we're zoning for the future, because we know it takes years to actually develop subdivisions, apartment buildings, whatever it is, right? So you often find that, especially in the built form space, and maybe we can segue to that, most people will complain about the idea of an apartment building that is being applied for at 9 levels on a block that has a zoning that has an acceptable height of 6 levels. The neighbourhood will be up in arms saying developers are looking for a bit of extra profit here, they're not sticking to the rules. And you can understand how the local community would see that as a sleight of hand. But the reality that people need to start recognising is, putting aside apartment buildings just not working in the main WA at the moment anyway, if they did, they only work with 3 or 4 extra stories higher than where the current zoning is. Is that to say that the developer is looking for extra profit? No, it's actually the height of minimum profit. It's to say that the zoning just is not up to date. And I think you could say that not only for where we're zoning land on the fringes, moving that from urban deferred, but also, as I've just said, to infill projects too.
And we have to find a way for that right now with the cost increase of building. I had a neighbour come to me the other day. They know I'm in development. They came across, and I live in Wembley Downs. They came across and said, "Oh, we want to sell. We're trying to downsize, but we can't find anything." And I actually pointed them to the Blackburn Ocean Village up at City Beach.
Looks great, doesn't it?
Yeah. They're like, "Oh, really? I can buy an apartment less than $1,000 from my place?" Yeah, sure you can. Be out for it. But there's very little choice, whether it be apartments vertically or even medium density is very little downsizing, but also the ability for first home buyers to get into their first property. So in the established inner Perth.
Yeah, because cheaper property, a bit more housing diversity in the brownfield space. But the ironic thing is, that guy or the next door neighbour of him will be vehemently up in arms about April's proposal at the Boulevard in Floreat for 20 stories. That apartment development essentially saves everyone in the rest of Floreat needing to subdivide their backyard one day because the local government's been forced to make everyone's property subdividable. You put all the density in the activity centre, everyone's backyard is saved. The trees are saved. Nah, we don't want 20 stories. Make sure it's only 10 stories. Well, where are you going to put those people? Because they're inevitably going to come. They're either going to come through downsizing or, as you said, a first home buyer who doesn't want to move out 30 kilometres from where they grew up.
Yep. And I think that's the challenge for Perth. Perth, particularly the inner 15K, is very suburban. It's got an underlay, historical suburban underlay, where the ability to pull together decent and good housing choice density is really difficult. So the likes of Floreat, that's a really good example. I was in there the other day having a look at the presentation within the shopping centre, and it all makes sense. And it's in an area that's not going to impact any neighbours. There
are no neighbours.
Yeah, that's right. It's got a little area where they're proposing some resi area to upsize and density. But to me, that's a really good example where you have an activity node with all the offerings within that node. It's perfect.
That's where you put it.
Yeah.
And that, as we said, saves everyone else from having to deal with the heartache of their backyard being split up, or the trees and the noise and the extra parking, the cars, the traffic down the Access B streets.
The precinct planning is really important. I think getting early, and that is a precinct plan, if you like, precinct planning so that people know what's planned into the future is really, really important. So you're not picking off individual developments, but elevating it to a precinct plan. This is the way that Glendalough is going to develop. This is the way that Wembley will develop into the future. And having to say then, rather than the NIMBY at the individual property level, debating against individual development is wrong.
Stockland's a big company, a lot of money, a lot of success, a lot of capital behind you. You do a lot of land development in WA. You also do quite a bit of medium density stuff, or at least you're trying to as well, right? I reckon you probably want to do more than you are. But that is the question. If you could, would you be doing more medium density? Would you be doing apartment development if you could? That's the one challenge that I would like to put on the bigger developers in Perth, your Peats, your Stocklands, your Saddleys, is that, hey, you are a part of the solution on the fringes, but can you also be part of the solution in the infill space too?
Yeah, and certainly Stockland Interstate, and we've just won a government bid to develop a 3,000 dwelling precinct at Waterloo in Sydney, and that will be, I think it's 50% social housing. We've done apartments in the past, but this is the first decent apartment complex we'll be building into the future, and it's a medium, longer term thing. But locally, we're very much in the medium density. Canopy at Glendalough, launching into the teeth of COVID has been quite difficult, but we're getting there.
How's it going? Give us some details on the construction, but also value, sales prices.
There's 97 2 and 3 story, 3 and 4 bedroom terrace houses, all green title. We're just launching the last stage at the moment, 14 houses just starting now, and most of the rest of the 80 odd have been sold. In regard to price points, I think we started at about a $750 odd average price point across the 2 and 3 story product.
In COVID?
It was quite scary at the time. It was a product that, versus Glendalough, that's got a bit of a patchy history of attached social housing and everything else.
And you would have had really no price evidence at that point, would you?
No, it was well in excess of the median of Glendalough, but we had confidence in regard to the destination and the product and the size of, I think it's 2.7 hectares, so big enough to create a destination up against Lake Mungar, good location, train station down the road. It's going really well. The issue there has obviously been through the teeth of the building industry and the cost, everything else. Our other project we've got at the moment is Beaconsfield. We just had it approved last week with the City of Freo.
Congratulations.
Yeah. It's
how long did that take From first acquisition to lodging to approval.
Yeah, probably over 2 years. It's
crazy, isn't it?
And I suppose we went through quite a few changes there in response, particularly from the city. And actually, we've ended up, I think, with a better product. Sometimes you can forge on, but certainly what will end up there is 206 1, 2, 3, 4 bedroom product, 2 and 3 story.
It's a real diverse community.
Yeah, and it's perfect where it is on the outskirts of South Freo. That whole little industrial area there will develop over time. We've had history down in North Coogee in the developments we did down there. It's a fantastic part of Perth, and like I said, we got our approvals last week through the city. They're looking to launch out pretty soon as well. Obviously, we've talked about costs. Costs have gone up significantly since we bought it over the last 2 years, but also the revenues in the established market has helped sustain the returns as well.
So in this project in Beaconsfield, are you selling the land or are you building it with a build part? So do we know who the builder's going to be?
No, we haven't announced that yet, but we're close to announcing that.
Okay, so it's in one big built community that people can just buy ready to go.
Yeah,
that's fantastic. So essentially off the plan construction. If you had 2 or 3 more opportunities in Perth, would you take it right now?
I think so. Once these building prices have stabilised, and they are now, from what I'm seeing, you get more certainty. Certainly, we've gone through a surge in median price in regard to different suburbs, so you get more certainty both in the revenues and in the costs. So once you've done that, you can start to have more faith in your assumptions. So the last couple of years has been pretty difficult trying to get a handle on both revenue and costs.
Do you think Stockland will be in the apartment space anytime this cycle in WA?
Not at this point. I think our main focus is really Sydney and Melbourne at this point. But certainly we've been in the apartments in Perth previously, but it kind of straddled the GFC. So, but certainly it's one where we want to grow. It's not always apartment or nothing. It can be blends as well in regard to medium density apartments and lots. So we're not saying no, but certainly looking at the various options in regard to the different product types.
The reason I ask is not to put pressure on a company like Stockland to do so, but more as a barometer, because if a company with the resources, the skills, the capital like Stockland is saying, well, look, we're probably sticking it in the medium space right now rather than in the higher density space, it talks to the broader dynamics of where our supply probably is going to come from. You've got your likes of Finbar, of Blackburn, of Edge, and a couple of other companies in that apartment space, but it's not enough. These guys are specialists in this space with not a lot of experience in land, not a lot of experience in medium density. So they stick to what they know.
Yeah.
But I think if you start seeing your Stocklands, you start seeing your Mirvacs, your Pete's, your Saddleys, these sort of companies who really should be and are in a national space as well, quite multidisciplined, start to look at apartments in WA, you start to see some green shoots and a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel for broad-scale supply in Perth one day. But it's not now, clearly, in that side.
Yeah, certainly as I said, the costs part of it, and until a apartment project stacks up, not just in the western suburbs, but it becomes
in Beaconsfield, for example.
For example, Beaconsfield, the apartment market in Freo isn't that huge. Most of the want down there is in the either terrace or freestanding housing. But certainly, as things normalise in regard to costs and revenues, and we start to developers, what I'm talking, start to get more certain regarding that they can invest with more certainty.
And I think that's a cultural thing. I think across the country, the cost to build an apartment isn't that much different. There's some variances, but it's not that different. But the difference is the profitability, I guess, the feasibility of doing it. And the difference in WA being that whilst it might cost, let's say, $500,000 per apartment to build, not including land and other things like that, and it might be the same in Brisbane. In Western Australia, that 2-bedroom apartment, you might not be able to sell for much more than that. But in Brisbane, you could sell for $800,000 straight away. And it's a cultural thing, I think, in Perth, where across the East Coast, they've certainly started to normalise around the lifestyle and the benefits of downsizing. They've come to that through necessity, just on house prices in the first place, but also really proactive zoning, the market that's a little bit more mature than ours. In Perth, as you mentioned before, we haven't really, as a culture and therefore as a planning system, really needed to mature to that yet. We haven't really had to accept apartment living in the norm, in the main, in Western Australia. And so our price points don't reflect us accepting that. For us to have a 3-bedroom apartment and be happy to move into it in Bayswater, for example, the 3-bedroom house probably has to cost 30% more for us to compromise to an apartment. I don't think you see as much of a compromise on the East Coast as you do in the WA culture.
And obviously we need to learn from interstate examples and some really great examples that I've seen in different cities, particularly Brisbane, for example, to me has really taken on built form.
Especially along the river.
Oh, it's beautiful. I was out there about a month ago and just walking around. I grew up in West End in Brisbane, and seeing the change to a community and a suburb and the change it takes on is it really enlivens the whole community there. It's a diversity of product, a diversity of people, it's choice and everything else. I think we, without downgrading Perth too much, we need to understand the benefits it brings, not just the here and now, but also to the future for our kids, for the ability to work where you want to work, live close to where you want to work, in regard to the product you want to be in. To me, it's a real understanding of that product choice that we need to encourage and really have choice for customers within their suburbs or close to their suburbs or close to the work. What do they want to choose? We don't have that at the moment.
The amenity can be phenomenal. I was just taken through a tour by Scott Cameron from Finbar a couple of weeks ago at their Civic Heart development. And it's just phenomenal, Col, when you think about what's in these places. Not only does everyone have their own parking, as you'd expect, but you go in there to the shared amenities. There are doctors' consulting rooms there for you to have a doctor come and see you in your apartment. There's massage rooms, there's libraries, there's guest rooms for if your parents came to stay, they can stay in a spare guest apartment that you can rent for $20 a day. Crazy. There's kids' playgrounds like the Fun Factory, ball pits and everything, theatres, dining rooms, general hangout rooms, pool tables and everything like that. These are places that you sit there and go, geez, I wouldn't mind hanging out here all day. Amenity that isn't akin to the apartment buildings we're used to seeing 20 years ago, where it was the pool and the gym with a yoga mat, right? And I didn't even mention the gyms. So living in a place like this, in a place like South Perth,
I was going to say,
right?
Great location as well.
Unbelievable to mix this all together. And I think that's when people start coming over mates' houses, their parents decide to do that downsize or whatever it is and start to be exposed to, look, well, what we've got in our apartment building.
Yep.
Hopefully that starts to permeate through the culture, because there is no going back here. There is no turning around, and as much as the NIMBY culture that we seem to be fighting against is resisting, there is only one direction that this is going. If we're going to have more people and we want to live in a more tight-knit community, we have to build up.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's obvious when you look wider, not just Australia, but globally, just the energy it brings, the community it creates, it's all positive.
Let's look into the next 12 months, if we can, in Perth. Obviously, Stockland's spending a lot of time, as it has historically, in the land development space. What does it look like for you guys in terms of your rollout? What are your pressure points? What are your opportunities?
From the market perspective, and as you know, the established market is so tight, it's going to take a while for that to unwind. We've still got the demand, population demand, the jobs, everything else is looking good. Our number one target at the moment is bringing our new communities to life. It really is the Beaconsfield that I talked about before.
So it's delivery.
And getting approvals at the front end to deliver. Stockland's got 3 large communities in the pipeline in addition to our 5 active ones at the moment. All they need is approvals to bring them to life. There's about 10,000 lots across 3 different corridors.
That'd help.
That would help.
Yeah.
But again, it takes years to get there. And having a coordinated, holistic approach by government and key government assessment planning, really.
So it's environment, it's planning, it's Water Corp and Western Power.
Yep. And what you just said is reflected on other states as well. I think we, as a community, need to wake up to the need to have a front-ended supply and understand it, maybe educate the community a bit more, not just the here and now in regard to the house they're living in, but how it looks into the future, how it looks in regard to their kids and beyond.
So for 2024-25, delivery is the focus. And because of that, I guess you're not seeing a lot of downside on the sales part of the business, right? The demand is essentially as high as it's ever been for your products, isn't it?
Yeah, without wishing a global issue coming up, certainly locally, I think it's looking all good for WA. Like I said, the economy, the population, all the demand drivers are there. It's about how do we make more efficient supply.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think most developers, you ask them right now, what's the biggest issue? It's certainly not sales. It's, in a lot of cases, unless it's apartments, it's probably not even profitability. I think price points getting to a point now where the industry is incentivized to provide the supply. The issue is the chokehold of actually providing the supply. It's the delivery. We want to deliver. We want to get this done. Why aren't you letting us?
Yeah.
That's essentially what it is.
Yeah.
Because there are certainly people on the demand side, both sides, buyers and sellers, want this to get done. They all want a roof over their head, or they want to provide that roof over their head. Everyone's incentivized to do that.
Across Australia, more than 95% of housing, as in all forms of housing, are provided by private industry. A lot of the focus seems to go on the government in regard to social housing. It is a very small part of the equation. It's obviously an important part for that part of the housing continuum, but really the focus is making sure that property companies and developers can make the decision to push the button on the various types of housing that bring housing to West Australians and Australians.
If the private market is incentivised through the market to provide product, let them.
Yeah, not just incentivised, just making it stack up. It is really difficult on the back of the cost increase, particularly for built for. Stop holding up the supply equation. Make sure you understand what's going to happen in different precincts and different suburbs, and make sure we educate those suburbs and those communities. But get behind it. It'd be great for it to be bipartisan. I've got concerns both nationally and locally that not everyone gets it. They'll use the anti-development lever
to win votes.
We need to, all of us, government, industry, need to educate the community in the need for housing choice across the suburbs.
Well, I think we need to educate the other side of politics as well. And as you said, the Labor government in Western Australia clearly is intent on helping to solve the problem. To whatever level of efficacy they are, at least we know that they want to. I think we're all confident in that space. I think this would probably be a message to the Liberal Party in Western Australia. Make sure you are too, because there is always going to be the deep blue side of Liberal Party, I guess, that is very conservative, very much not in my backyard. But that new generation of conservatives that you're hoping to attract, those people do not have the same priorities. Their issues are cost of living. Their issues are, I might have grown up in the western suburbs, certainly can't afford it these days. How about an opportunity to live there again one day? And that comes from some pretty brave and proactive planning reforms that allows for people to retain themselves in that community. As we said before, first home buyers are not just young people from the outskirts. They're also people who have grown up in the western suburbs and look at the prices in their suburb and see no opportunity to live where they grew up. And I think most of us would like to do that at whatever price point our parents bought into 30 years ago.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think some great initiatives have taken place. Let's execute them.
Exactly. Col Dutton, GM of Stockland WA and also President of UDIA nationally. Thanks for the chat on the state of the market nationally and in WA right now. It's a very interesting time watching the acutely undersupplied micro environment in Western Australia against the backdrop of what is a very topsy-turvy macro environment in Australia and globally right now. I think we all sit here with bated breath to watch what the next 12 months looks like for us.
Thanks, Trent. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Perth Property Show. If you've only just joined the conversation, you can catch up by heading over to our website, perthpropertyshow.com.au, subscribing to the podcast, or joining our Facebook page. Don't forget to tune in next Monday at 7 a.m. for more expert insights, local analysis, and suburb spotlights. Happy hunting!